Mark chapter 8. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, Do you not yet understand? And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man, and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, Do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, Do not even enter the village. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, Who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, But who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, You are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, and the gospel's, will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Done. Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, as we just read. Now, it starts off with this discussion of thousands of people coming together to listen to Jesus and his compassion on them because they hadn't had anything to eat. And again, we see in the parable of in the account of feeding 5,000, there was a certain amount of food, and what was gathered up after thousands of people ate and were satisfied. And then here again, the same thing. So we see that Jesus is trying to teach them something. He even tells them a parable here in Mark 8 to go with that. So the question happened because of the food and the actual need of food for the people. And then the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod that Jesus warned them about. And it seems to me that this blind man being healed in Bethsaida has something to do with this. When Jesus, who has all power and authority to give sight to the blind, when he does that for this man, the first time he sees in ways that he's never seen before, and yet he still doesn't see clearly, and then he comes back to Jesus, and Jesus clarifies his seeing, his vision, and then he's able to see clearly. And I think that that's something, even if it's not the exact reason for this parable, I think it's certainly pertinent to the parable, because they have now seen multiple times the miracles of Jesus, the prophecies of Jesus, the healings of Jesus, the power and authority of Jesus to even calm the wind and the waves on the sea. They have seen all of this, and yet they're still not seeing clearly. And that brings us to this portion where Jesus begins to foretell his death. Now, Jesus knows he's going to die. That is why he came to this earth, to be born, to live among us, to walk out in perfection obedience to God the Father, and to give himself as a sacrifice for his people, that he would give his own body, his own blood, to take upon himself the wrath of God due to our sin, so that we do not have to endure that. Rather, Jesus has taken our place. He's a perfect substitutionary sacrifice. So verse 32 is kind of the critical juncture here, in that Peter rebukes Jesus. He's telling Jesus he's wrong, but here he's saying, but Jesus, you still don't understand. And Jesus, I think that's what we're seeing here in this chapter, is Jesus is saying, you're beginning to see, but you're not clearly seeing. And he says to him here, he says, get behind me, Satan. And then Jesus, like the master storyteller that he is, uses this lack of understanding on the part of all of the disciples and the lack of understanding on the part of Peter, who, because of his lack of understanding, instead of being humble and listening, decides to rebuke his master. And then he says, what will it profit a man if he gains the entire world and forfeits his own soul? He says, whoever would save his life, desire to save his life, will actually lose it. And whoever will give up his life for the sake of the gospel will find true life. So I think that's something we can look at our own lives today. I can look at my own life, certainly, and say, I want to do, and I believe I understand what God's will is for my life, because there are certain commands in the Bible that explain that to me. And thankfully that God has given us his word to instruct us. So as a husband, I can say, the Bible tells me to love my wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And I could say that as a father, the Bible commands me in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but instead raise them up, train them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But maybe I desire to train my children in God's ways, and God's ways have said things to me that maybe I don't understand how they work. Or maybe I think, well, that was 2,000 years ago. Surely it's not my duty to train my children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And yet that's exactly who he commands to do it. So if God has called us to do something, he will equip us to do the work that he has called us to do. We actually saw this in our family devotions this morning as we were reading in Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. But as a family, that's what we were talking about this morning, is that the disciples were given very specific instructions after Jesus both died, was buried, was raised from the dead. He said, stay in Jerusalem, don't leave, and wait. It won't be a great number of days, but wait until the promise of the Father, which is the Holy Spirit, comes upon you, and then you will have power and authority to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and the uttermost parts of the earth. But can you imagine, Jesus ascends into heaven in front of you, and you say, Lord, what are we supposed to be doing? He says, just wait. What does he want you to do? He wants you to wait. So maybe today God has you in a season of waiting. I'm having a hard time with words today. And maybe he has a time for you to go, and he's commanded you to do something, and you need to live in obedience to what he has called you to do. Only you know for your own life. As we apply the scriptures day in and day out, we'll continue to look at these things. We'll be in Mark 9 tomorrow. But for today, I really want you to think a little bit about what has God called you to do today. And are we walking in obedience, or are we questioning God whether he knows what's best for us? We ought to remind ourselves that God knows all. He created everything, and he is sovereign over everything. And so we can walk in obedience to him today and every day. We'll see you tomorrow.